of the 19th century compared to the 20th century, there was a relative stability, and it was usually when we went off the gold standard or had some type of a national bank. I mean, that we've been fighting this since the time of the founding of our country. You know, it was Hamilton and Jefferson fought it, and first and second bank, and then look at what Lincoln did. He massively inflated and had a national banking system. Even so, the dollar maintained its value rather well. They had respect for gold, and there was a limit. It was up until 1971. There was a relative connection to the dollar.
Well, you're all Austrian. You're always looking to Vienna. Explain to the non-sophisticates, what is the Paul view of Austrian economics?
Well, my view is that Austrian economics has it right. They've been right on all the predictions. They have predicted from the very early years. Mises, who was the leader in the 20th century on Austrian economics, even in 1912, understood the business cycle rather well. And they are convinced, as I am, that when the Fed creates credit, it causes malinvestment, too much debt, and eventually leading to higher prices in different segments of the economy. So it explains the bubbles and explains the corrections that always must follow. So they anticipated, as I have talked about over the many decades, that we would have a major financial crisis. And now we're looking in Washington, and they're always trying to solve the problem by talking to the economists who didn't anticipate it, and they're doing the same thing that created the problem in the first place. So the business cycle, if you want to understand the business cycle, understand how we got here, what the answers are, one has to understand Austrian free market economics.
Within that, and with Schumpeter coming on later, and the credit expansion coming out of World War II, are you suggesting that we go back not to a gold standard, but a more rigorous and conservative economics that comes with it less credit availability to make the American engine go?
I think deciding how much credit you need isn't the part of the government or economic central planners, and that's what the Fed is all about, and that's why they make mistakes. In a free market, credit is created. And, as wealth is created, you and I might extend credit to each other, but we have to have an asset. It's just that the measuring rod would be something that wouldn't be up and down every day and couldn't create out of thin air. It's like building a building with a yardstick that changes measurements every day. So the currency is the measuring rod. Under a gold standard, you would have that as the measuring tape and the measuring rod, and this, to me, would provide sound economic growth. But you don't have to you don't have to immediately get rid of the Federal Reserve in one day. This could be worked out through the marketplace. And the gold standard that we did have, as you inferred earlier on, there were some problems because we can do much better. We had bimetallism back in the 19th century, and that was fixing the price of gold and silver. But today, due to the Austrian economists, is much better understanding of this whole system and why the solution for me is to allow competing currencies.
I believe you just said you don't want to end the Fed. You want to gradually amend the Fed into a different organization. Is the real reality and political reality of what Ron Paul wants to do, is it just to simply move the Fed back to the traditional Fed of, say, June of 2007?
No, I want to get rid of the Fed. But what I'm saying, in the transition, you don't have to close it down in one day. If they want to clear checks for a while, that's fine. But to allow them to create money out of thin air endlessly to monetize debt and do deals overseas and with private corporations, that's what needs to be ended. So, for all intent and purposes, it would be ended. In a free society, you don't need a central bank. As a matter of fact, it almost is impossible to be a truly free society if you do have a secreted central bank who controls all money and credit. It contradicts the whole idea of individual liberty and free markets.
Why have most nations decided to enjoy a central bank?
Because we're all Keynesians now. Nixon had it right. We all became Keynesians because that is what we have been taught, and it's also because of our sophistication. expansion in many ways. We've allowed the bubble to get bigger than ever before. We weren't all Keynesians, and the market kept reining things in and saying, no, you can't do this. And they would go back to the gold standard after the war. After World War II, they went back to a pseudo gold standard, and they quit printing money. I mean, they did print a ton of money in World War II, and they went back. But because the world became Keynesian and they believed this stuff, and it was drilled into everybody, they allowed the biggest bubble in the history of mankind to be built.
Well, Congressman Paul, Dr. Kaufman, who worked for Salomon Brothers and the big banks, he's associated, I would suggest, with big, giant banks. You both say the same thing. There's been a consolidation of banks. Dr. Kaufman looking for partnerships and a more responsible management. Are there getting to be too few banks?
Well, I don't think I'm going to make a judge on how many banks you should have. I think what I object to is when government regulation and inflation and too big to fail distorts all the views. It may well be in a free market there would be fewer banks and it would be very big. I mean, we have a relative free market when it comes to computers and Microsoft and some of these other places, and they get very, very big. But they're big because they provide a service. But if you have only 5 banks and it's due to the fact that government bailed them out. I mean, Goldman Sachs survived, but they also got a lot of benefits. They're not big because they're truly free market people, sound money people, and didn't benefit by the taxpayers bailing them out. So the size and the numbers aren't as important as who's controlling.
Well, won't you suggest, though, there's been some institutions that have been bailed out and indeed collapsed as we look at 1 year since Lehman Brothers, but maybe Goldman Sachs got the cash at a certain time, but didn't they pay it back with a profit to the government?
Yeah, and they're still making lots of money, but Lehman Brothers...
But is it bad?
We got rid of their top competitors. We got rid of Lehman. So
that's true. There's fewer competitors out there, and that's what Dr. Kaufman says. But is it a bad idea to make a lot of money?
No, it's a good idea if it's honest. So I don't begrudge somebody who makes it in Microsoft if they don't get any benefits from the government. I mean, in the old days, General Motors and Ford, they made an honest living, but now the government owns General Motors. They should have been gone bankrupt. The good assets should have been bought up. But this whole idea that you prop up bad assets, we're doing exactly the opposite. Inflation causes malinvestment, and people then go broke, and then the government bails out the people who had all the benefits.
This is important. Why don't we have the consolidation that confronted the early Austrians? What has happened in Washington that won't allow business failure?
Antitrust laws, principally, is one big one, and then the regulators come in and they regulate, even though some people might not be able to voluntarily come together and become bigger in the marketplace, they get bigger and wealthier because of government regulations and directing of capital. We might find out all kinds of things if we look into the Fed and have an audit. We might find out why some people did get much bigger and why maybe I think the military-industrial complex couldn't have existed without the Federal Reserve. I mean, they love it, and the people who benefit this way will always argue the case for the Fed because otherwise, this money machine would be turned off. So this is it's the people who get the money first that benefit the most. So when the bankers and big businesses and politicians get a hold of the money, fine. But when the little people get the money, they pay for the inflation with higher prices, which is the tax.
Healthcare. How many babies have you delivered?
Over 4,000. How
big a practice did you have? How many employees was under the Paul shingle?
Less than 4. 4, would be the maximum, I guess, we would have in a couple aides and nurses and an insurance clerk.
You talk about the giant banks. Who's the evil one here in this healthcare debate? When you see all the rhetoric and the back and forth, you're a doctor, you've met a small payroll, but nevertheless a payroll. Who's to blame?
Well, it's the system again. It's not medicine's not delivered by the market; it's delivered by management. And government management came in to fold about in the early 1970s. And that was under Nixon, under ERISA laws, which introduced and forced management. HMOs and PPOs. and then it became a corporate system. We don't have socialized medicine. I don't think even Obama's going to give us socialized medicine because he's pursuing, corporatism. So the corporations who get big, not because they're providing a service. The truth is, the doctor and the patient doesn't need a corporation to direct everything that they do. So it's the management companies, it's the drug companies, it's the insurance companies. They're the ones who lobby. Most of the lobby in Washington,